Philip, I think it's because I'm not a co-host, so I cannot see people in the waiting room. Philip is the host, so you need to assign me as co-host. Yeah, yeah, there are people. Okay.
Oh, we thought we were going to get to leave early and have an Aperol spritz.
We can still try to do that later.
So, Elizabeth, probably you can stop sharing your slide for now, because we also have this slide for the session.
Okay.
Yeah, I will share the slide from my. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Good.
Okay, well, I think I will start with my introduction, and then I will hand over to you, Elizabeth, for your talk.
Okay.
And I assume people will get in the next few minutes, but I think it makes sense to start now so we can have, as you said, an early apéro.
Sure. Sure.
Okay. So my name is Alice Vadro. I'm a professor in international politics and the environment at the University of Vienna in Austria. And I would like to welcome you all to the Twin Politics Ocean Seminar Series. So today's talk is given by Professor Elizabeth Havice. Its title is Ocean Data Science Initiative and the Making of Ocean Worlds. I will say a few words about Elizabeth. So Elizabeth is a professor at the Bowman and Gordan Gray Distinguished. She's a Bowman and Gordan Gray Distinguished Professor of Geography and the Environment. She's an economic and environmental geographer at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She uses the lens of governance to explore distributional outcomes in marine spaces, food systems, and global value chains. She's a co-founder of the Digital Ocean Governance Lab that explores the intersection of data technologies and ocean governance, and she has recently co-edited the Routledge Handbook on critical resource geography. In addition to academic research and teaching, she works in advisory roles for Pacific Island country governments and other nonprofit groups interested in marine resources, value chain analysis and economy, environment intersections, and more broadly. So today, she will talk about the proliferation of scientific efforts to create and mobilize new data technologies to sense, see, and know oceans in new ways. So we have, as some of you may remember, in the first part of the Ocean Seminar series, we asked practitioners to share their perspectives on recent ocean data initiatives, including the digital ocean twins. We invited Alain Arnaud and Nicolas Segebart from the European Commission and Mercator Ocean International to share their visions for creating digital ocean twins. And then in the last session, we had Pauline Korenhof, who presented her work as a philosopher on the digital ocean twin. And today we have the real pleasure to have Professor Havice with us talking about Ocean Data Science Initiative and how they contribute to the making of ocean worlds. So Elizabeth, the floor is yours. Welcome to our seminar and thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me. And shall I share my screen now? Okay. Okay. Great. Thank you so much. The series overall sounds terrific, and I'll hope you'll be able to catch up a little bit on some of those when you create your YouTube channel, which Philippe mentioned to me. And I am just really excited about the work that your group is doing and the intersections with the work that we've been doing with our Digital Oceans Governance Lab. And I'm really pleased to share that with you on behalf of the group today. And I want to note that I'm presenting this from the perspective of from a geographic perspective, and there are lots of complements there with political science. But we can start with the ways that in 2014, in their book on human geographies in the ocean, Anderson and Peters reminded us that our world is a water world. For this audience, I don't have to emphasize that too much, but they noted that even though the oceans, we all know the ways that the oceans and the seas are entwined in our everyday lives, until very recently, geography, and particularly human geography, and I think other social science disciplines as well, had reduced the sea to a perfect and absolute blank. And perhaps that's a little bit of an overstatement, given the long histories of ocean sciences, of oceans industries, and philosophy and historical work on the oceans. But the point is that the sea has often been characterized as a wilderness or a void. And this is in part because of the ways that it's difficult for humans to sense and see beyond the coastlines. But in the 10 years since Anderson and Peters wrote this book, times have certainly changed, as you all know from your work. First, the oceans are now a rich and central site of geographic theorization around questions of borders, of state power, of space, and many other issues. And second, while scientific research in the oceans is nothing new, the past decade has, of course, seen this absolute proliferation and acceleration of scientific efforts to mobilize new data technologies to see and know the oceans in new ways. According to Tanhua et al., for instance, more data about the oceans is currently generated in a single year than over the past century, resulting in what Brett and colleagues call a data tsunami. And of course, all of this new data presents technical and ethical challenges, but overall, there's a widespread enthusiasm that new data technologies will fuel this new era of oceans governance in a time in which the oceans are often decried as being in crisis. So in fact, this is precisely the optimism that fuels the UN Decade on Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. I don't think I need to talk about this too much since many people here were participating in UN Decade relevant activities in Nice over the past week. But of course, the UN Decade has the compelling tagline, "The science we need for the ocean we want." So we'll set aside who the we is for a little moment, but what science, what ocean, and all of these questions are really relevant. So the work that I'm presenting today is situated at the intersection of this proliferation of scientific efforts to see and know the oceans in new ways on one hand, and an increasing interest in expanded oceans governance. These two trends are interrelated and they're co-produced. New knowledge of the oceans is both driven by and also motivates new interest in oceans governance. The entanglements between data and governance are reflected in general concepts like the blue economy, and more specifically in various negotiations for agreements, for instance, the BBNJ. So the question that I want to address in this talk is as follows. As scientists are better able to sense the oceans, what are the kinds of technico-political entanglements that are emerging at this interface of new data technologies and oceans governance, and to what effects? The premise, the work aims to answer conceptual questions about the role of new data technologies and also the organizations that make the data. We're interested in asking, what are the data? Who is making and interpreting it? And what might data do in shifting dynamics of oceans governance? Our premise is that first, data do not speak for themselves. Sensing the oceans takes work, conscious decisions, and these are all in the making. And second, that the nexus of new data science and new oceans governance is developing rapidly, and it's a site of experimentation. Organizations now rely on new data forms to produce transformative information about the oceans and human activity in them. This is disrupting established policy and practices and presenting potential for new ways to sense, see, know, and interact with the oceans. So we think they're worth studying. We know you do too, because you are studying them in these ways. As I proceed, I want to specify some of our key terms. Our project is interdisciplinary, and so we're collaborating with incredible marine biologists, marine geospatial scientists, geneticists, and so we found that making the collaborations work require building shared language and concepts. So in that tradition, I'll start with our definition of new data technologies. We started using this term in distinction from big data to draw attention to the work and the infrastructure that's required to gather and make sense of data. The terminology builds from critical data scholarship, and it enables us to parse methods of data collection or generation, the data themselves, and the platforms, analytical techniques, and infrastructures that go into making them. So the attention to this terminology reflects our methods. We're interested in the processes and the expertise that goes into revealing or sensing the oceans, rather than presuming that data reveal truths. There's technical and social work behind the depictions of the oceans with data, and this term aims to capture that work, give us the concept and the method to do so. And we also intersect these with a reading of governance that emerges from political ecology and environmental politics. Policymaking and management are specific terms. They entail plans of action to achieve specified ends through rules, principles, law, enforcement directives, etc. Policy and management often specify what is to be done and by whom. But governance is a term that we use specifically that's broader than these terms, even though they're often used interchangeably. Governance is the combination of actors, institutions, legal processes, political economy relations, and knowledges that are involved either directly or indirectly in environmental decision-making. This conceptualization and the specificity of this term broadens decision-making power and authority beyond the state and state-centered authority, recognizing non-state authority, corporations, NGOs, civil society, philanthropy, et cetera. And critically for our purposes, science and technology are central to determining what and how to govern and lending legitimacy to actors that are seeking influence. And also to scientists and scientific bodies that are playing a role in governing. So this term of governance enables us to situate data and the initiatives that make them. So the intersection of new data technologies and governance take particular forms in the ocean. You don't need me to tell you about the complexity of sensing in the oceans. But overall, our premise is that digitizing the oceans is more than a technical exercise. It's a governance exercise. And it's unfolding where the lines that are delineating state space and non-state spaces, as well as the actors that are involved in policy decisions, are incomplete, are contested, are in the making, and full of possibility. So data and the organizations that make them are inserted right in those dynamics. So from here, I'm going to talk about 3 parts of our overall projects that we've been working on in the Digital Oceans Governance Lab. I'll start by talking about our work and also giving you a little bit of the trajectory of how we started with this sort of line of inquiry. I'll start with a case study of Atlantic bluefin tuna. Then we'll talk about ocean data science initiatives and our work to kind of try to do some cross-cutting analysis of them. And finally, some great work that our graduate student, Emily Melvin, has been leading on visualizing the oceans with data. So let's start with tuna, one of my favorite places to start. So the idea for this project started more than a decade ago when I started to notice the new advances in satellite telemetry that were being applied to highly migratory fish. Particularly the highly valuable Atlantic bluefin tuna, which was also facing a management crisis at the time. Overfishing and illegal fishing were rampant, and they were driving population decline. And there was a really sustained international push and political debate about which countries and which actors were responsible for taking action to reverse the decline. Part of what made the action so hard is that bluefin are highly migratory, and this raised questions about who owns them, of course, and who's responsible for their management. In part, a fundamental lack of knowledge about tuna populations, the inability to sense, to monitor, to track, to count them, was attributed blame for population decline. This looked positioned to change in the early 2000s when methodological advancements in satellite tracking, otolith microchemistry, genetic analysis began to reveal Atlantic bluefin tuna. Let me see. Oops, sorry, I'm on the wrong side here. Suddenly, satellite tags were showing fish in space and time. And about this time, I started reading papers and seeing some of the presentations about these new data, and a couple of things struck me. The first thing was how powerful the visuals were. We'll come back to this a little bit later in the presentation, but some of the earliest publications showed movements of a single fish or multiple fish in space and time, and they completely transformed understanding of individual fish and of the entire populations in the ocean. And when I saw these data being presented to public audiences, I noticed the ways that they sparked this sort of shared understanding and enabled researchers to tell very convincing and powerful stories about these mysterious but economically and ecologically valuable animals. So here's some examples, right, of a single, these are very common for us now, but in the early 2000s and up to 2010, they were absolutely transformative of the location of individual fish and these heat maps of concentrations of valuable fish. The second thing that I noticed was that researchers, when they presented these scientific findings, they also often coupled them with a statement that such data was essential for improving management. In a sense, they were suggesting that the clear and better data would inform and thus lead to clear and better and simpler management outcomes, right? Like it was just so obvious what we need to do when we know where these tuna had their breeding grounds, for instance. So this became really complicated for Atlantic. Oh, so here's an example. An improved understanding of bluefin tuna migration, spawning location, stock structure is clearly necessary for fishery management regulations to be equitable and for rebuilding efforts to have maximal effect, right? So this was really common sort of accompaniment. Now, the complication for Atlantic bluefin tuna was that although these fish were migrating throughout the ocean, previously in the 1980s, the countries that were involved in management agreed to draw a line down the middle of the ocean and to create two distinct management units. One that breeds in the eastern side of the Atlantic and one that breeds in the western side of the Atlantic. Each side was set to do their own population analysis and to set their own quota for the countries and members on their side. And the models that were used to do this work assumed that there was no mixing across the two sides. So you can see how this is problematic as soon as these data from the previous slide showed those fish moving all the way through the Atlantic. So what happened when the data and the population models clearly showed that fish do mix across those two sides of the line, and that in a fish from one side that breeds on one side of the ocean could be caught on the other side of the line? The question that we asked is, did this change management and improve policy outcomes? So we spent a bunch of time with the scientific community, the scientific committee that manages Atlantic bluefin. We went to the commission meeting as well, and to follow how these data were basically inserted into the management process. And I'll highlight 3 outcomes from what we found, although there were so many. It's super interesting. The first finding was that the ways that science is shaped by and unfolds in political context has implication for what it becomes and what it can do. It's impossible to separate new data technologies from the historical politics of debate that precedes them, even in these empty spaces of the ocean. While this seems obvious, it's worth emphasizing because of the imaginary of ocean spaces and resources as frontiers, as empty of people and politics, and ripe for scientific discovery and intervention. The crux of the challenge for bluefin was this management line in the ocean that I've just mentioned. According to one of our interview informants who was involved in the process, everyone knew that this line was a convenient fiction that the US pressed for a particular political outcome in the context of interstate management in the 1980s. The origins of this spatial management approach were political rather than scientific. New data started to make this fiction harder to hold because it clearly showed that fish crossed over the line and over time was able to show with more resolution which fish went where. These data were also driving progress in modeling science as modelers innovated new ways to incorporate mobility into the stock assessment process. The political actors, the member states who wanted fishing quota, right, that's the result of these models, were firm that they wanted management advice that held the status quo and allocated quota around the two sides of this line, right? So even though there was all of this innovation in data and technology, the political actors were saying, wait a second, we don't want this system to be disrupted. This is because political and economic interests had formed over decades around this line in the middle of this ocean, a political artifact. And new data technologies had to work within this frame, and their possibilities were shaped by it. So according to one of the modelers in the process, when reflecting on what it would mean to offer management advice based on a model that could incorporate the new mobility data, they said, it's not so much the quotas that people are worried about, but a loss of certainty in another sense, that at least politically, there's a clear dividing line, east and west. They assess separately and they allocate and they manage separately. That's what government and industry are used to and are comfortable with. So the takeaway point is that there's no blank canvas for new data technologies. As new data technologies reveal new understandings of oceans and resources, new knowledge will be employed in political contexts with existing boundaries, existing authorities, and long political relationships, even in the oceans that are often defined by their gaps in authority. So the second point is that as modelers began to explore what a management process that used this new spatial and temporal data would look like, their new mixing model raised the possibility of moving away from that east-west management to be more precise in time and space throughout the ocean. So with these new possibilities, scientists moved to start exploring from that 2-box model to create a 7-box model in the oceans and to model how tuna move through them over time and space. This is what it looked like, right? So you can still see that original line. With this specificity, management possibilities multiply rather than resolve. The new model opens a wide range of technical possibilities, though of course these potentials are shaped by politics. So scientists reflected on the possibilities. So one said, one scenario is that we get east and west origin, and then we assign quota and a projection forward from the most recent assessment that takes on mixing in each box, each of the 7 boxes, in each month, and says how much should be caught in each box in each quarter. By doing that, we could get a formula to get a localized, geographically specific catch to maximize management goals. That's doable, but then you have to decide how to allocate to the countries, and this will get to be immense. So scientific advancement can yield new understandings, but as the real starts to come into focus, possibilities for management can multiply and reconfigure rather than resolve, which sounded to us like a really big tension from the way the data were originally presented as simplifying, as clarifying, as actionable. This is in part because of the next theme that emerged from this work that has to do with uncertainty and complexity. As new data technologies resolve one area of uncertainty, for instance, what are an Atlantic bluefin, where do they go? They can destabilize and introduce uncertainty into other areas, such as the population models. So this is again contrary to a notion that data can reveal and simplify problems and solutions. So let's stick with this move to the 7 boxes in the tuna case. To include movement in the model had to change dramatically. The model went from having one model that was applied separately on the east side and the west side to a model that required 7 ocean areas instead of 2. It required including stock of origin data. Was that fish one that breeds in the Mediterranean or in the Gulf of Mexico? It also had to include temporality. They had to include 4 different seasons, right, to capture the way the fish moved over time. And it also had to introduce 3 different tuna age classes because tuna go different places at different ages in their life. So for instance, juveniles don't return back to their breeding grounds. So this is the tip of the modeling iceberg of complexity. The scientific committee actively was debating if using these data would lead to a better outcome. And they raised the concern that data problems could lead to erroneous scientific outcomes and in turn to political destabilization in the management body in ICAT. Some went as far as to suggest scaling back to the 2-box scale. According to one scientist involved, this could, quote, eliminate some of the data conflicts, as well as reducing numerical computational complexity, not least because no one seems to be contemplating a more complex spatial management arrangement than what is currently in place. So what are the takeaway points from this work? Ocean data science initiatives, new data technologies, and the scientific community are squarely positioned in the current expansion of oceans governance. But more data and new data technologies do not in and of themselves make problems and solutions clear. Instead, our analysis finds that new data technologies can be seen as the grounds for debate, using William Rankin's terminology, a new geo-epistemology in oceans governance that will determine control over contested spaces and valuable resources. So for our team, this foray into the impacts of sensing of satellite telemetry, we did a comparative study with between bluefin and marine turtles. It really just piqued our curiosity. And it was at this moment when the digital possibilities were beginning to really expand. So we began to wonder how we could more systematically think about the data revolution in the oceans and its relevance to governance. So we wanted to know not just about the data and its effects, but about the organizations that were gathering, processing, and circulating data about the oceans. Who were they, and how do they work, and with what kinds of relationships to management and policy? So this is our second part of the presentation. So we decided to study ocean data science initiatives. Of course, there's not enough acronyms in the ocean language, so we needed to add another one. And we defined these ocean data science initiatives as organizations that mobilize new data technologies to produce new knowledge and understandings of the oceans in support of oceans governance, so that they have a particular goal of mobilizing data in some way. And what we decided to do methodologically was to create a catalog of ocean data science initiatives. We've gathered 97 total, and we selected 3 different sectors, ODSIs that we're working with on fisheries extraction, on basic science, and on biodiversity conservation. And we created we made a database. Oh, let's see, do I have I took out the QR code, but I can send a link to the data set, which is publicly available. And we used their websites, the material that they provide themselves, and coded out for their characteristics, their purpose and their problems, their policy aspirations, and also the ways that they visually represent data, among other variables. So what did we find when we looked into these ODSIs? The first thing we found is that ODSIs are headquartered in the global north, specifically in the US and the European Union. This could be a function of our sample, but we did explicitly look for ODSIs in the global south, and we found only 7. Some of these may be because they're private sector, some could be because of language issues, but overall we saw this trend. The state and environmental NGOs have also long been recognized as key players in oceans governance, and we found this to hold for our sample of ocean data science initiatives. 50% of them are government initiatives, 30% of them are from NGOs. Of course, this is really interesting and important as the US pulls away funding from scientific research. And we also found similar dynamics for funding bodies, with governments funding about 55% of ODSIs and philanthropies being the next most important. A small percentage of each of the rest were corporate or private, but this is also likely a growing segment and worth more study. We've been definitely looking for specific private ODSIs to include in our case studies, in our data set as well. Beyond these really general ODSI characteristics, we wanted to drill into the ways that they define problems and solutions for the oceans. So to this end, we coded out the stated purpose of each organization. And we found that ODSIs elaborate a range of different purposes for their work. Of interest, we found that half of them propose to influence management or governance as the key element of their stated purpose, which suggests that these ODSIs see their work not just as revealing the oceans, but as linking to action. Nearly a quarter of them also defined a stated purpose in relation to data. And here we see some ideas about what ODSIs want to do with their data. So policy and governance, right? Here's just an example of how they talked about our goal. This is the Fisheries and Marine Ecosystem Model Intercomparison Project. Our goal is to bring together disparate marine ecosystem models to help better understand and project long-term impacts of climate change, et cetera, and to use our findings to help inform policy, right? So these are the kinds of things that we were coding out. And for data, we saw, for instance, that the IOC, Ocean Data Information System, will be an e-environment where users can discover data, data products, data services. So their purpose is actually to continue to think of ways to build data, interoperability, and sharing, for instance, across different actors. But we also wondered, for these ODSIs with a data purpose, who did they see as using their services and for what outcomes? So for all of the ODSIs, we took the next step to explore if and how they engaged in management practices or talked about engaging in management practices. So we created a stepwise approach to try to understand their engagement with management. We started with the most general coding, which was just to ask if an ODSI defined a policy concern. So here is an example of that. What is a policy issue that the ODSI seeks to inform? Here for the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network, they said that they aim to provide the best available scientific information on the status and trends of coral reef ecosystems for their conservation and management. So here we would code, for instance, a policy concern related to biodiversity, to a management practice, and to data sharing. After identifying the policy concern, we next asked if the ODSI identified a specific group of people or an organization responsible for acting on the concern, and if they developed a specific policy proposal for addressing their concern. In the interest of time, I won't go through all of those examples, but the final and most specific question was if the ODSI's work led to a policy or governance change. So we have an example here. From the International Seabed Authority's deep data database, where they say that their records have informed environmental planning for the CCZ, resulting in almost 17% of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone being entirely protected from mining. Right? So that just gives you a sense of how we did our coding. When we looked across the catalog about these questions about policy, we found that ODSIs are very interested in policy. 78% of them specified policy concerns, and 70% of them had a clear sense of who they thought should do the work of making the changes. But then it was less common for the ODSIs to specify concrete policy proposals and that link their work with data to change how problems are managed. And again, less common that they credited themselves with driving a specific result, although 38% of them did make this claim, which is, I think, quite a few. So I want to emphasize here that this kind of analysis, and in fact, the whole project that we're working on is not a criticism of ocean data science initiatives. What we want to do, and we have not throughout this entire project sought to make any normative statement about what they do. Instead, all of this kind of work is oriented to helping us think about ODSIs as actors in oceans governance, to placing them and to placing their data and their role in how normative frames and action in the ocean unfold, right? So this is something we've had to really figure how to communicate very clearly with our audiences as we've been publishing. So overall, these findings suggest that ODSIs are diverse and rich actors in the science policy interface. And our study of them shows how data and science are mobilized in producing ocean worlds in multiple ways. And I'd like to leave you today with one final, let's see. Sorry, here's the summary of the kinds of governance actors that ODSIs are. Based on those initial the initiative characteristics, we could argue that they reflect interests and concerns of the global north. that they reflect interest and concerns of states and environmental NGOs and philanthropies, and that also they're open to scrutiny. We found a lot of them, the vast majority of them had open data, so they were open to people using and reimagining and reanalyzing with their data. Based on their own stated purposes and problems, we found that they approach ocean problems as technical and largely ignored political questions about how data would be used. Often they reflected tensions about not enough data versus lots of data that's difficult to get through. And finally, based on these policy aspirations, we found that they urge attention to policy and action. They often identify who should take action, but they often underspecify proposals or outcomes. And there was almost no discussion of investments that would be required to make use of data and ODSIs in policy. Okay, so now let me leave you with this final example of sensing the oceans with data that focuses on mapping. This part of our project, again, I mentioned earlier, is led by our terrific graduate student, Emily Melvin, who's asking if and how ODSIs use new data and representations of the oceans. And of course, as geographers, we love to think about maps. Of course, mapping is very powerful in making understandings of the world. And this has always been true of the oceans as well as terrestrial spaces. So in the 16th century, for instance, Western maps depicted the oceans much like land as spaces of nature and human activity. And then later, as mercantilism unfolded, map makers began to show oceans through mathematical abstraction and as guides for empty spaces to be facilitated for economic connections. And of course, today, depictions of the oceans have become increasingly specific as mapping techniques have grown in sophistication. So are new data also shifting the ways that humanity or scientists or other users visually sense the oceans? In our study, we noticed as we built this catalog that many ODSIs present their data in the form of maps. So we asked, how do ODSIs map ocean data and what kind of ocean worlds do these maps create? So we created another catalog. The QR code is here this time, so you can look it up. And we went through and pulled out all of the kinds of maps that were on the Ocean Data Science Initiative's websites and develop a coding framework to try to analyze what was in these data. And what we found was that ODSIs visualized their data in ways that presented not one, but many visions of the ocean. Across the catalog, we identified 4 themes about how ODSIs sense and then visualize or represent their oceans. And ODSIs used their data or showed their data in ways that showed the oceans as voids, the oceans as state territory, the oceans in crisis, and oceans as spaces of data. And I'll talk through 2 of these categories just to give you a sense. Here is the overall, these 4 themes I just mentioned, and we analyzed 66 fixed maps and 66 interactive mapping tools. So those are the kind that you can plug and play to do some of your own mapping with them. So I'll talk through these last 2 categories, oceans in crisis and oceans as spaces of data. In the oceans in crisis theme, we noted that maps use data about the oceans to depict anthropogenic impacts through bright colors, such as red, orange, and yellow. This won't be a surprise to anybody. This map is an example from the sea around us, which depicts fish catch intensity. The map shows areas with high concentration of catch as bright red. Of course, this evokes emotion associated with danger and warnings and leaves a normative impression that oceans are in crisis in areas of high fishing. Part of the power of mapping rests in making threats more visible for practices and processes that have been invisible or out of sight. Through data, these kinds of maps of crisis increase the visibility of threats that are otherwise difficult to see. They illuminate the role of data in highlighting these threats in ocean spaces. Our theme of oceans as spaces of data was the one that surprised us the most. Maps of this kind emphasize the existence of data. For example, maps might show the geolocation of data sets or of scientific research and monitoring efforts. Here's an example from Pangea, which is a repository of geo-referenced data about oceans. The user can click on a data set and get additional information from any one of these, small arrows on the map. And so this map makes data availability visible on a global scale, including for small scale data sets and those that might otherwise be difficult to spatially depict at all. So the maps in this theme showed not what we know about the oceans, but simply that we know the oceans. They suggest that data are relevant throughout oceans simply through their existence, regardless of what kind of phenomena they study. And they also place ODSIs as key actors in organizing and mobilizing data. So what kinds of ocean worlds do ODSIs create? No single theme was dominant, but rather we saw a range of possibilities emerging for how ODSIs may use data to visualize their oceans. This is in part because ODSIs are diverse organizations with different mandates and motivations, right? So we found that data can be written on oceans in ways that are not bound by territory or in ways that re-emphasize the importance of the state as a unit of governance and of management and policy, and of course our crisis and spaces of data section. So overall, these maps reflect the interests of map makers and what forms of data are available, and in turn, they influence map users' perceptions of what kind of data are important and the purposes that those data serve for management. Within this diversity, scientific data are playing a role in shaping what is and what is not visible in ocean space. So to conclude, I can return to our question that I began with. Are scientists better able to, as they're better able to sense the oceans, what kinds of technopolitical entanglements are emerging? Satellite tracking of bluefins showed us of ODSIs and of visual representations of data lead to three final conclusions for today. First is that diverse forms of knowledge, organizations, and representations are emerging in the data revolution. On one hand, this means that we can sense the oceans and our planet in ways never known before. On the other, the relationship between sensing and being, knowing and governing remains underspecified and in the making. Second, data do not speak for themselves. There is much work that scientists, advocates, policymakers, and others must do to make sense of them. And here is where the we in the science we need for the ocean we want matters a lot. Which ways of knowing are dominant? Which ways are excluded? That is, new data technologies are an important ground for debate. They are the new geo-epistemology in oceans governance that will, at least in part, determine control over contested spaces and valuable resources. And finally, a practical point, the intersection of new data technologies and oceans governance broadly is a site of experimentation that is in the making. From a practical standpoint, this means that as investment in new data technologies to fix challenges in the ocean expand, there is an urgent need for simultaneous, meaningful investment and reflection on how existing and new institutions engage and navigate the new data technologies and emergent governance relations that are resulting. Future work should continue to explore what it means to sense the ocean, and to specify what the science we need for the oceans we want is, and which governance relations will get there and through what pathways. So of course, your work is contributing to all of that work, and I will leave it there. Oh, and I guess just one thing is our amazing acknowledgements. Lisa Campbell at Duke University is my co-PI on this project, an incredible collaborator. We have all of our team members who've contributed data, and we've been funded by the National Science Foundation here in the US.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for this fantastic talk. It was amazing to see all these different aspects of your work all in once and embedded into your broader ontology. So thank you.
Thank you.
I will open the floor now for questions or comments. So if you do still, just briefly say your name and then, yeah.
That'd be great. Should I stop the share?
Yeah, maybe. Why not? I think.
Okay.
I mean, I have a few questions. So maybe if people need more time to get confident enough to raise or to get the floor to the floor. So I think one. So maybe I will ask all of them at once. So one thing I was wondering is the relationship between like the new data technologies, as you call them, and maybe some more traditional ways of collecting data on the ocean. And I'm asking this question because as part of the Maripol data project, we conducted like a laboratory ethnography to better understand how marine laboratories monitor marine biodiversity. And what we found, and we are in the process of actually getting a publication on this out, but it takes some time because laboratory ethnography is of course very intense.
Yes.
But the thing is, what we noticed is that it seems to be very hybrid, like a mix between very new ways and technologies to monitor biodiversity, but then also very, let's call them traditional ways of collecting data. And so how do you see this relationship? Because you focus a lot on like the infrastructures, but behind that are many like human activities or socio-technical arrangements and networks that make this possible. So I think that's one question. So
should I answer that one
maybe,
first?
it was a big one. So yes.
No, it's such a great question. And also I really loved and appreciated your previous article that I read recently about the lab ethnography. And it's such a good question. And I think in a certain way we have, we regret the new data technology terminology and using it. Maybe not regret, but I think it's what has become really clear is that it's only a part of the story and that new is always changing. And, that we have been surprised, I think, in many of the cases at the ways, okay, the data are coming together and there's new efforts to integrate them, but that there still is a lot of just old school nuts and bolts work that needs to be done. So I think our terminology, when we originally developed it, it was because everything was getting lumped into a big data idea. And we wanted to find a way to sort of parse that out and to say, no, it's not all big data. And that the specificity and the science actually really matters. And so that's part of why we've really loved your ethnography work. And I would love to actually hear your thoughts as well about writing about that work, because one of the things we have really enjoyed, but also struggled with, is the balance between the details of the actual scientific practices and having to know the science and know the models and know how things are changing and to write about them, and then still being able to tell a story that like a general reader will want to engage with and read. So I think you're 100% right. We have found the term useful, but we have definitely had a lot of conversations about, are we contributing to just the erasure of the actual practices, which are a very clear combination of new and old. And there's so much attention and excitement, especially even since we started this now, how AI can be used to integrate and process these data, but still somebody's, taking the cores and separating them and doing the counting and sorting. So I think that question is right on, and it's really worth continuing to be as specific as we can about the science that's in question.
Yeah, I think you were referring to this paper in ISIS on the social science side of marine biodiversity, where we somehow tried to put together, to make the point that it's extremely difficult to study marine biodiversity monitoring as practice. And this is what we somehow found, but we also, I think, found that that communities are important, and this is actually my second question. So a lot of these initiatives seem to be driven by the idea of an international community somehow. And I was wondering to what extent, like the multilateral agreements that were put in place to govern the ocean collectively, whether they are also important actor to push for those specific data actors.
Yeah, that's also a great question. So for the two case studies that we started with on Atlantic bluefin, and marine turtle. We looked at the marine turtle specialty group of the IUCN that does the red listing process. And so both of those cases have these transnational dimensions. And then for the ODSI work, we limited our data set to ODSIs that work on regional and global scales only. So part of the lack of information from communities at the community level in our analysis reflects those decisions of the case studies. But certainly, we see some of the tensions and questions that come out there about the sort of balance between global data sets and very localized knowledge. I think we saw that huge tensions around that over the last couple of weeks in Nice, of the sort of acknowledgement of the need for community-based data, of indigenous knowledge, of all of these different kinds of data, but a little bit of a question of how does that even work? What does it look like? What would it look like for there to be meaningful engagement? And I also think there's a real scalar tension between wanting to develop technologies that are globally and universally valuable, but then what questions can you answer through that global scale? So, and I think with the digital twin, we saw this over and over again in the last couple of weeks, where they're like, look, here's the digital twin. It's so fancy. It's going to be global. It's going to do everything. It's going to show everything. And then you'd ask a question, what can it show? And they would say, well, let's look at this very specific place, and we can run the model right here in this very specific place to demonstrate to you what it can do. So I think it can go both ways, right? That the global can erase that community or local level knowledge. But I think the reverse is true as well, that in these applications, to make them meaningful and usable, we might also see that, their applications at a very, very local level. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's a good one. I think it's a real point of contestation and questioning at this moment of which data are most meaningful and for whom, and how can the global scientific community make good on these efforts to be more inclusive in knowledge forms and in the application of knowledge. I also thought there was a lot of tension at the meeting between just having to know the global and trying to make it useful for people, So I think it's a really interesting question and one that's not resolved. And I don't think ever will be.
Okay, there is a question. So please, Elsa, introduce yourself and go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I am Elsa Kikasan. I am originally from Colombia, and I'm living in the Netherlands, and I'm working in offshore wind. My background is as a biologist, not a marine biologist, but I'm working in environment. So offshore wind is soon coming also, or going soon also to Colombia. And just like as general knowledge, I wanted to ask you, what would be your advice on how to support the policy development in Colombia? Because you mentioned the global south, and then I was like, yay! But still, we're going to have the wind farms in the Atlantic. So at least that's more north a little bit for us. And which kind of data, the data sources, how to present the data. As I mentioned, I'm not a marine biologist. I come from biomechanics, so I'm slowly going in that direction. So things might be already happening in there, but just to understand how to frame data science in this context and for an ecosystem like Colombia.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Elsa. Unfortunately, I do not have an answer for you. And I think that what's important is asking the questions of mobilizing data for better management. What does that mean? What are the policy objectives? What are the ways that policy, what do interest groups want? And then how does the interface with data, with knowledge, become a part of the decision-making process or not? So I think it's always the question of what do we mean by better management, by better outcomes? Who is the we asking that question? And now I sound like a broken record saying that over and over again. But I don't think there's one good form of policy outcome or decision-making outcome. And so I think for communities in Colombia that are engaged with the question of offshore wind, I think it's a process of deciding what matters most, and how does science help to navigate through those problems or not? Maybe science is not the answer to the questions that matter most. It might not capture the things that people really care about, or only partially capture the things that people care about. So yeah, I think being really clear, and I think that goes back to the way that we started this project when the satellite tagging, everyone was like, look, it's going to be so easy. We're going to resolve everything. It's going to be better now. But what were the questions they were even asking? What does it mean for policy to be improved, to be clearer, to be better? We can't assume what those goals are.
Okay. Yeah, because so far, like in one of the discussions of people interested in the subject, the question, I raised the question of, okay, how are we gonna mitigate the effects, the environmental impacts? And yeah, in Europe, this and this and this has been done. I'm like, yeah, I know what is being done in Europe, but we're going to do that in a different ecosystem. So it seems that still we might be lagging a little bit behind, but there is some time. But it's a little bit concerning that it's not gonna maybe be directly related to science, because then it becomes more.
Yeah, I mean, of course,
involved.
science should inform the project, but what are the questions that need to be asked, right?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We have a second question or comment by Juliette. So.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Juliette. I'm about to join Sciences Po in France, Sciences Po Paris, as an assistant professor, and I've been doing a PhD on the surveillance of tuna fisheries and oceanic environments in the Western and Central Pacific Ocean. So obviously what you said was resonated a lot with my research. And I just wanted to know more about like how you identified the various initiatives you made the inventory of, and if you like the difficulties you encountered in that process, because I find that there are lots of initiatives, but they're hard to read. And also you mentioned that you categorized them and differentiated between fisheries-oriented initiatives and between biodiversity conservation initiatives. And I wanted to know if you found significant differences or specificities between the two categories, because, in my field, I could also see like very distinctive bubbles between the two communities, but that was not like at the core of my subject. So I was intrigued to see if you had dig this more as well.
Thank you so much for the question, and congratulations on your new job.
Thank you.
Also, I would love to see your work on the fisheries. So please feel free to send it to me, or I can look you up now. That's a great question. So how did we select the ODSIs that are in our catalog? So we started by selecting these three thematic categories: fisheries extraction, biodiversity conservation, organizations working for biodiversity conservation, and basic science initiatives. We have about an equal percentage of each of those three. And we just selected those out of our interest and also out of our personal knowledge from the beginning. We thought that those would be the sectors that in our team we would be most easily able to identify. And so we really started with our own knowledge. We have senior personnel on our project come from Duke University's Marine Geospatial Ecology Lab, Pat Halpin's group, and they are actively involved in some of these biggest ODSIs, the obis, the state of the world sea turtles database. So they have also been super helpful in helping us to identify and think through and make sense of the organizations. It has been really hard, right? So many of them are overlapping. Data from this one also goes into data from this other one. There's umbrella organizations that are clearinghouses. So it's been a lot of manual work. And this is the first kind of project that we've done like this. Usually we're doing case studies and we're doing interviews, we're doing very qualitative work. So this was a big experiment for us in this kind of methodology. And we spent the first year and a half of the project developing the catalog, selecting those ODSIs, having a lot of conversations about which one even qualify as our definition of ODSIs. And one of our objectives of selecting these 3 different sectors was to look at the differences across them. And it's been really interesting running the data because, again, we wanted to step back from specific examples and try to say, what is this universe? There's a lot of attention to the data or to specific data products. But we think that one of the contributions of this project is theorizing the organizations, the institutions as actors. And so we've run a lot of comparisons of the findings across the different sectors. And sometimes those are meaningful ways of understanding things, and sometimes they're not. But there are definitely differences. So the fisheries extraction one really stands apart from the biodiversity conservation and basic science ODSIs because they are generally devoted to monitoring, enforcement, legibility, surveillance, and showing fisheries. And they have already a specific management body that they can talk to, right? So they are already sectors that are regulated. And so we see a really different kind of motivation and a different kind of intersection with taking action than we do for basic science, which is we need to know more, right? That was another thing we really heard in Nice. Even though we've made so much progress, we really need to know more. We need to have better interoperability of data. We need to be able to put these data sets together. We need to have long-term curation and, of course, more collection. So we've been working, Juliette, if you have more ideas about how we can write about this, we would love to hear them. Because our first paper on the data set, we took a subset of 30 of the ODSIs, and our wonderful postdoc, Lauren Dracopoulos, led that paper. I think I included it in the list. And we pulled out some of the key ways, and we did differentiate a little bit between some of the differences across those 3 sectors. And we continue to run through the various analyses. Right now we're working on we've been looking at how the ODSIs address questions of equity and if they address questions of equity. And so we've also been looking for differences across those 3 different groups. So yeah, it's a work in progress, but there are differences. And the question is what is meaningful and important and how do we communicate that?
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Sorry.
Thank you.
Please, Juliette. Juliette, do you want to respond to this?
Oh yeah, no, I just wanted to say thank you, and yeah, happy to write you maybe about this topic. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it'd be great. I would love to come visit Paris.
And also congratulations from my side on your new position.
Yes, terrific.
Thank you very much.
So we have another question or comment from Romina.
Hi, everybody. First of all, thanks for this presentation and for your work, because I just started a new postdoc in the Trieste Laboratory on Quantitative Sustainability, and we're about to define the project also with data. And I've been screening myself, but just your catalog will help me so much. So
great.
I mean, I think it's for everybody who gets started in this world. If they find the catalog, it's a very good starting point.
Great.
And I was just wondering if you have, because I already went to the page and opened the Excel file. I was wondering if you have a file with more information that you classified yourself, for example, I don't know, size of data sets or so on.
Yes, we do have more columns in the in the catalog that we didn't publish all of them because some of them, because the work is so manual, and also because Romina, I'd love to hear how you go forward. And also if you have ideas for improving, like what doesn't work from ours, because we were really learning as going. We also were I would advise also working with some data science, sort of digital literacy collaborators. So we were working with some people on campus who really just specialize in that dimension of work to help us think from the beginning about how to set this up. And I can send you some ideas on that if you're interested.
That would be cool.
And so as we started to develop our columns, we did have some that were related to the data, the kind of data. And it's just the work has been so manual. So we've had this team of wonderful undergraduate and master's students, but it's also been really hard. Like for a long time, our work was just like meeting week after week to talk about consistency across the segments and to answer questions like, does this fit here? Does that fit here? And then we started to, as we moved through with time, we started to prioritize different sections. So for instance, maybe with that data, we had some that was on data type. We maybe did like 30 of the ODSIs. And then we were like, oh, there's a lot of problems with these data about how we're going to compare them. What questions do we want to ask with this? And that would help us decide, do we want to keep collecting data across all of the ODSIs? Or do we want to put that aside for later and maybe come back to it? Because there's a lot of data there and a lot of different variables. And as we were gathering those data, then that helped us to get a sense of what kinds of questions we want to ask of it. And then we also ended up creating for a lot of the columns something that was like the specific summary of something like what kind of data, how much data. And then we tried to create a sort of summary category next to it that would be more comparable across the ODSIs. So it would be like, is this is the organization fit into one of 3 categories around data? If we started to see that across, because otherwise there was just so much qualitative data that was populating each of the cells that there wasn't any way to make it comparable or to look across the ODSIs. So that has really been like in motion as we've gone. And the other challenge is doing the research just from their web pages because they update their web pages. So we had to be careful in our documentation and really try to think about how do we narrate a story about our decisions and justify this as a data source that is always in movement, and we may not be able to refer back to it.
Yeah, I understand, and it's a tremendous effort and very, very helpful.
Oh, great. I'm glad, because we're also like, oh, it's only 100. Like, is it so it's interesting to hear, and we would welcome any feedback on it as well as a starting point. And of course, now we're like, oh, could AI do this all for us? Could we automate this? Could it be? So anyway, we'll see.
Yeah, great. I don't see any questions. I mean, maybe just, do you know who has been using or downloading your data set? And for what purpose?
We don't know. We know that it does give us, we used a public repository. We started with using a qualitative digital repository that's run through Syracuse University. But it turned out to be very expensive to use it, and it's just an Excel spreadsheet. So we switched over to, my university has a public digital repository. It has all of the right metadata. Our librarians are incredible in terms of helping us think about, when do we publish it? What are the best practices about making these data sets available? So we switched to using them. And so we have our first version was on the Syracuse University qualitative repository. And then the second version is in the University of North Carolina. And it does just have counts of who's downloaded, but we don't know who is using it, if anyone, or how they've been using it.
Okay, well, fantastic. So thank you so much for this wonderful talk. If there are no more questions, I think we can just stop earlier. And please feel free to reach out to us. We can connect you to Elizabeth, and we have a recording. So if there is interest in the recording, we can also share this. And I see when Wen is sharing the screen. So yeah, we will upload the different ocean seminars on our YouTube channel. And this gives you the opportunity to also watch the previous sessions that I mentioned at the beginning of our seminar. And we are currently putting together the program for the second term, which will start in October. So this was our last session. I see, Elizabeth, you have a question.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much for inviting me. And it's been so nice to be in touch, at least over the year, and to be connected to your group. And I'm very excited to see how your project unfolds and how we might be able to just continue these conversations. So thank you for convening also this great group. It's really helpful.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I wanted to give you the floor, but I think now it's also a good time. But yeah, no, we were really happy to have you here. And we also had Lisa Campbell a few years ago, I think. And I think this is an excellent group doing amazing work. And I think that it would be good to have also future exchanges. Yeah. So we may get back to you maybe if we progress in the ocean seminar with maybe also some presentations by the colleagues that you mentioned. That would also be really interesting. Okay, so thank you also for everybody who attended. And last but not least, I would like to thank my colleagues, Wen, Leo, and Philip Baum, who organized and also who looked at the technical aspects of today's seminar. So thank you so much. Have a lovely evening. And for our Austrian colleagues, don't know how many there are, have a nice public holiday. Okay.